Welcome to this very special episode in the Public Finance Podcast series, where we explore the critical issues affecting services across the UK. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the financial settlement and the outlook for 2023-2024. I'm delighted that joining me online is Dan Corrie, Chief Executive of the New Philanthropy Capital think tank. And here in the studio with me is Justin Galliford, CEO of Norse Group, which is owned by Norfolk County Council. And I should also point out that Dan has some specialist knowledge, as he was previously head of the Number 10 Policy Unit for Prime Minister Gordon Brown. Both, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Chris.
Let's set the scene, because we're sort of in a no man's land at the moment, because there's a settlement that's claimed to be landing on Christmas Eve, which literally as everybody's going out the door, that's not helpful, is it, for anybody? Dan, you've been used to the sort of dealing with settlements and things. Is this usual?
Well, the local government settlement does sometimes come very late. I mean, historically, I'm sure in my memory, it may even come later than that at this times. Deeply frustrating, because it makes planning completely and utterly impossible. I've never quite understood why it takes so long, where you have to wait for the autumn statement, see what's around. There's some shenanigans between departments all having to agree and things like that. But if central government spent a bit more time thinking, how can we behave in a way that makes it easier for local authorities and local public services to deliver, they would have got it out, day after the autumn statement at the very latest.
So there's a bit of discipline now. Justin, you're working with local authorities, you're delivering services. So actually, and you've got a plan. Is this frustrating?
Yeah, I mean, in practical terms, it makes it very, very difficult. We're setting our budgets at the moment with our customers, but of course, you can't really get certainty. And for local authorities that, of course, need to ensure they have a balanced budget against a predetermined timeline, it's very, very tight indeed. So it's difficult for authorities to consider sensibly the future, and actually it can begin to put pressure on operations as well, services they deliver.
What is it that councils need to hear? I mean, and it's not small money either. I mean, we're talking billions of pounds in a lot of authorities. So, what do councils need to hear? Is it do they need a multi-year settlement? Dan, you'd have been on the receiving end of these conversations. What was it that they used to say to you? Is actually we need we've got plans for long term. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think the multi-year thing, Chris, you're quite right. That's the most crucial thing that councils would want. I mean, obviously, they want a big number as well. And you also get arguments because in the settlement, obviously, not everybody gets the same. And people will say this is unfair. Why are they getting this and we're not getting that? And I think people naturally, human beings want to see some kind of fairness and understand how decisions are being made. But I do think ultimately, if I had to choose one thing, I'd go for the multi-year settlement, because that does allow planning. It does allow people to think, well, I know I've got that money, so I can do something this year, which it isn't going to pay back till year 3, but that's okay. I can do it. Whereas if you have no idea what's going to happen the following year, yet let alone in the third year, you're forced into making different decisions, short-term decisions, which certainly won't save you money in the long term. So it doesn't do any of us any good. But at the moment, that's certainly not in sight.
What can the public sector do? Because obviously there are some very grim numbers that have been floating around, and depending on how much the core grant is, and councils having to rely on reserves and those sort of things. So are there what are the services? What are the things that can be cut? And what is there anything that local government can do, Dan?
Well, I think it is very difficult. Councils can't go out and sort of revenue raise, and those in the past who've tried to do sort of fancy commercial deals and stuff, a lot of them have come a cropper, and they certainly can't do it at the moment. I mean, obviously, councils are forced to just defend the statutory services, so the non-statutory stuff is all at risk. In the old days, we might have said, a lot of your in-house services cost too much, outsource them and all the rest of it. But in fact, at the minute, a lot of councils are insourcing, partly because they got a bit fed up with being overcharged by sort of incumbent providers. I mean, then the other thing, interestingly, that's happened a lot during austerity was whether the councils could get the voluntary sector that I work with a lot these days to sort of take on some of the services, so that, whether it's running the local community centre or library or something, or providing some of the sort of nice-ish to have services. But, charities have to fund themselves as well. It's not all done through volunteers and jumble sales and sponsored runs, and they find it very difficult too. So there's a limit to how much that could be done. And I suspect a lot of councils have done what you can do sensibly already.
Justin, is there anything else or is it just literally hunker down and just hope for the best and put on a grim face?
Well, I think, as we say, it's a very tough situation, and I think to a degree, the government is beginning to understand that, because only today we see a comment from Michael Gove encouraging councils to consider use of their reserves this year and perhaps next. The problem with that, of course, is once they're gone, they're gone.
And there are councils that have already announced Section 114 on the basis that those reserves have already been exhausted.
And again, I mean, today the LGA has published some results from a survey which, talking to its membership, is very clear that many authorities are now closer to having to consider 114 territory than they've ever been before, and certainly I think in our lifetime. So it is a serious situation. Using reserves might be fine in the short term, but it is not, by definition, a long-term sustainable option.
So, Dan, is this a situation where councils just simply push it back to the Treasury and say, this cannot be done, here's the Section 114 notice, good luck with that?
Well, it's one strategy. I mean, I do think that particularly what's been going on in Birmingham will be quite a shock to central government and to the Treasury. Even though everyone kind of knew it was happening, it was a sort of slow motion crash. And Birmingham's been in trouble for years. We knew about the sort of equal pay issue for a long time. But nevertheless, such a major, enormous council getting in trouble like this will have made people think. I mean, from my memory as well, it's always kind of frustrating in central government, because you look across the local government patch, and some of them, it's true, some of them haven't got any reserves, have used them. Some of them are in trouble for other reasons, but some do have reserves. They're in very different positions. And quite a lot of councils did actually build up reserves over some recent years. So you can see why the Treasury is kind of keen to get them to use their own resources before they start sort of knocking on the door and say, we're going broke, what are you going to do to help them? Then, of course, you have the issue, how does central government behave when a council gets in financial trouble? I mean, in countries like the States, if a local council or their equivalent goes bust, they let it go bust. And so there's a kind of disincentive to go bust. Nobody rescues you. In our system, you do sort of half get rescued. I mean, the commissioners get sent in to take over the council, so you lose democratic control. Whether that really is a kind of disincentive to people to behave like that in the future, whether the public massively care, whether it's their sort of elected council or some commissioners running the council, probably depends on what they thought council services beforehand. So it's complicated for the centre as to what to do in these situations, just as much as it's really pretty terrifying for councils.
Isn't it also worries like, if the number of councils goes up, have we even got enough commissioners to actually step in? I mean, there can only be a finite number of people. That's a minibus driving around the countryside at a frantic rate. If 10, 12 local authorities go under, and there's a capacity issue there, isn't there? Also, Dan,
there is. Although Max Keller, as ever, seems to be everywhere. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And for instance, I mean, I certainly know of a chief executive of a major council who, apart from trying to run that council, is also trying to help another council in trouble. Lord knows how you do both of those jobs. And that person certainly couldn't do another council. So it does get slightly crazy. I mean, from my memories of Whitehall, I mean, when I was working in the local government department of those days, which was, I think, DTLR. And we were certainly very, very reluctant to get involved in sort of running councils. So there was issues when Hackney was in trouble, for instance, because it's the last thing that central government wants to do, which is why you kind of send in commissioners, ideally local government type people, and you keep a bit of a distance. But you're right. And in some places like Birmingham, maybe in Liverpool, there may be things that have gone wrong that commissioners can help put right. But for a lot of councils now, it's just that the money's run out. They've not necessarily done anything mad or stupid or something that commissioners can quickly sort out. It's just that the money isn't there. And what can they?
I mean, let's take Birmingham as an example. I mean, is it, they're too big to fail, and also you've got some intrinsics that are just not going to move. And also, to me, things like particularly social services. There's been some, at the coalface are quite often some very, very good people who are making very, very difficult decisions and balancing very finite resources. And at the same time, it's unlikely the private sector is going to step in because of the risk profile. And also, you've got things like, a very fractured, care market. There's an awful lot that's driving this. Justin, what's your experience on all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think involvement from the private sector would be limited. The challenge is certainly there, and as Dan points out, the territory now really is, yes, there are some authorities that may have done some things which weren't very sensible with hindsight, but actually the vast majority, I think, of the authorities that are starting to talk now about being in concerning territory are just cash strapped. There's just not enough money in the system. So, in terms of a way forward, I think one of the really interesting things is, what is the definition of a statutory service? And it's quite incredible that there seems to be a bit of a debate around some of that. So I think we're going to see some interesting conversation authority to authority about what that looks like, and then what can you pare back, if indeed anything, because I have to say from many authorities we work with, they have gone through round after round of difficult cuts, and of course when you cut a service first time, it's slightly easier, but when you get to third or fourth or perhaps even fifth iteration, you can only cut something so much until you don't have a viable service anymore. So it is a real test for leadership teams, and it's a real test for those people on the ground making it happen, many of whom have had a career in local government and are dedicated to helping the communities they work in.
Dan, there's also the law of unintended consequences. I remember back when the Sure Start centres were under pressure and a lot of them got closed, and there was that fascinating photograph because David Cameron's mother turned up at a demonstration in Oxfordshire to save a Sure Start centre that she believes shouldn't be closed. I mean, there are going to be some difficult decisions, and doesn't this also the other group of people that are going to be drawn into this are the politicians, because they're going to have to make the difficult decisions, and that's both at central and local government, about things that stay. And there are going to be some challenges when local people start going, no, this needs to stay. What do you do? And also, does that public pressure reach Whitehall?
I think in different ways it does reach Whitehall, but I mean, what tends to happen, I'm afraid, given the way our country works and the geography, is you get a blame game that goes on. Is it the council? I think Nottingham recently got in trouble, and I think I can't remember. There was a quote from a Conservative minister or something saying,
Robert Jenrick, former local government secretary.
So just
of State.
saying, they've run everything appallingly. This shows why you can never trust a Labour council. And I don't know the ins and outs of Nottingham, but my guess is that he didn't do anything massively wrong. But he straight away wants to blame them. They will no doubt be saying, what happened was that the government didn't give us enough money, despite the fact we had a growing population of this kind of thing, which needed more statutory services or whatever. So we tend to go straight into whose fault is it. The poor old public don't really know whose fault it is, really, because it is hard to work it out. And I mean, that's not very helpful. But nevertheless, I do think if MPs in particular are picking up that their constituents are very worried about social care or about youth services or whatever, of course they'll go and talk to the council, but they will start putting pressure on government. I didn't go this year. I usually go to the Conservative Party conference as well as the Labour Party conference, and we do events there. And usually if you go to fringe meetings at Conservative Party conference, apart from the sort of very ideological ones, you get a whole lot of Conservative councillors, often from counties, who are talking about housing and social care, because that's what their constituents care about. Somehow it never quite makes its way up to national politics. I don't know why, but you certainly do get that pressure, and I think it will be on at the moment behind the scenes.
That neatly, there's going to be a general election next year, and it neatly takes us on. So, if we're talking about politicians and action and pledges and things, what must the next government do, or at least what must they not promise to do because they can't deliver it? I'm going to go with you, Dan, first, because you've been used to, if for want of a better word, the calibration of these decisions. What's your thoughts?
Well, there is a kind of worry that however much the famous Liam Byrne letter that said there's no more money when Labour left government, that the Conservatives will leave one saying there really, really, really isn't any more money. Now let's hope that's not totally true. I think it's going to be very difficult for the next government, even if they want to start trying to put more money and put more certainty into funding for local public services and local authorities, to find that money. So I think it'll take a little while for them to work out what's going on. I mean, there's some things you can do that are easy. I mean, for instance, in the whole levelling up agenda, we did end up with Lord knows how many different pots that you had to competitively bid for and have teams to bid for to get any bits of money. I think hopefully the next government will bring all that together into single pots and distribute it in a more sensible way. So there's some things like that which will make a difference, but they don't transform the situation. So I just hope that first of all, that the next government, something you've asked us about, Chris, do they take it seriously enough? Does politicians at national level? And I think hopefully, if it was a Labour government, they probably would, not least because they're very strong in local government and with the elected mayors and everything. And I think even just taking it a bit more seriously, you'll find that there are ways of getting a bit more resource to local authorities and giving a bit more uncertainty. But it's going to be very, very difficult.
Justin, your thoughts, because obviously you're dealing with all of this stuff. If you're whether you're writing a manifesto to central government based on everything that's going on, what would what do you want them to do? What do you not want them to do?
Well, I think the key thing that we'd not want to do is don't rule anything out. In particular, we've talked previously, but there are some oddities which are perhaps aged in terms of how funding works. So on the one hand, central government largely controls the funding that local government receives. On the other hand, it also limits its ability to raise council taxes. At the same time, we don't have multi-year settlement. So I would say please don't rule out having a look at all of that as some serious reform, because this is not a problem that's going away. And when you've got a long-term issue in the light of no emerging economic growth, you need to make sure that you're really having a mid-term to long-term view on how to fix things, not next year or the year after.
Dan, this feels to me like it's detail, which is, it's very boring and a very difficult sell to the public. And is that fair?
I mean, detail is always so difficult. When people are going out to vote, they're not really voting about the certain detail. But if it's a Labour government that gets elected, they've got these 5 missions. They're not going to achieve those 5 missions unless they've got local government back on its feet. So they're going to have to think about it.
That sounds to me like a note of optimism on which to finish. And if you haven't already, we had a mention of Liam Byrne, who famously left that letter at the Treasury, sorry, there is no money left. Well, you can hear more from Liam in a previous podcast. If you go to the Public Finance website, have a look on the podcast section and you'll find him there. It was a fascinating conversation, so do revisit that one. So thank you, Dan, for the opportunity of the plug, and thank you for joining us. Much appreciated.
It was a pleasure.
And Justin Galliford, thank you for joining us also.
Pleasure. Thank you.
That just leaves me to thank you, viewers and listeners, for joining us. And we look forward to you joining us again on another episode covering the many challenges, opportunities, ideas and possibilities in public sector and public finance. Thank you for joining us.